We are back in Exodus, and today we'll be in Exodus 17. If you look at your notes, I want to show you how this passage is structured, because I think that we'll get some additional light on the meaning of the passage we'll look at today, which is chapter 17, 1-7, if we look at how it fits in the general structure of this section of Leviticus. Basically, you see it there. It's what do we call that structure? ABCBA? Chiasm. Chiasm. C-H-I-A-S-M. And basically the structure starts with the defeat of Egypt, which is followed by a memorial song, the song at the Red Sea. And it's a memorial because it's something that's offered up to God. They sang it to the Lord, and it's something that they would sing again and again. It's made permanent. And then at the end of the section, we have the defeat of Amalek, which we'll look at next time in chapter 17, 8-13. And then we have another memorial there in verses 14-16. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial. Recite it to Joshua," that is, pass it on. Then Moses built an altar. Altars are memorials. They're things that are set up before God to remind him to keep the covenant. And the altar is equivalent to the book. And later on, we're going to have to look at this in a little bit more detail, but altars are physical forms of the Word of God. The primary altar is the Ark of the Covenant, and inside of it are the Ten Commandments. Later on, when God makes a covenant with Israel, blood is sprinkled on an altar, but the book of Hebrews says that blood was sprinkled on a book. Well, it's unlikely that they hurt the scrolls by putting blood on them, but they're equivalent. And so there are a lot of interesting aspects to that. And we'll touch on it a bit today as we look at the rock, but it's part of a general pattern. But here, what I want you to see is that the defeat of Egypt is matched by the defeat of Amalek. Does anybody remember who the Amalekites were? We're told later on in the book of Numbers how they fit into the general plan of redemptive history. And we'll look at this next week, but it might help you to remember it today. Were they just some tribe that they happened to encounter? They become a special adversary right here. Balaam says, Numbers 24, verse 20, "Amalek was the first of the nations, but his end is destruction." Amalek was the first of the nations. Numbers 24:20. So the importance of the Amalekites matches that of Egypt. And next week, I keep saying this, but I want to get a context for us. Next week we'll look at an Amalekite theme in the Bible, and we'll see that every time God sets up the kingdom, as soon as it's set up, the Amalekites attack and you have to defeat them. Saul was supposed to defeat the Amalekites, and he spared Agag right after he was made king. David, just before he's made king, has to defeat the Amalekites. The book of Esther shows that just as the Jews were returning from exile and the kingdom was being reestablished, they had to fight the Amalekites, because Haman the Agagite was an Amalekite. So this is a prominent theme that runs through the Bible. God gets you out of Egypt, starts to set you up, and the Amalekites attack. That's for next time, but you see the balance between the defeat of Egypt and the defeat of Amalek here. Now, sandwiched in between these are the two B sections, and that is the provision of water. They come out of Egypt, they sing the song, and right away they come to Marah, and in Marah the water was bitter, and they threw the tree into it. And remember when we studied that, that was a test for the bride. Remember that a water test, a bitter water test, is the way God tests the bride to see if she's been faithful or faithless. And basically Israel failed this test by grumbling. But that is the theme. The theme of testing is here. It says, "The Lord made a statute for them, and there he tested them." That's Exodus 15:25. Now the passage we'll look at today matches that, except that it's the Lord who's being tested. It says the people tested the Lord at Meribah. And Moses named the place Massah, which means test, and Meribah, which means quarrel. And chapter 17, verse 2, "Why do you test the Lord?" So this time the Lord allows himself to be tested. Again, we've got a problem with water. This time there's no water. And again, God provides it. But this context is God who's tested, and God passes the test. So that's the other side of it. Now, in the middle of this section, and remember the center of the chiasm is always the most important point. The outer edges set the context, and then the other things balance and shed light on it. So we get a kind of a visual picture of a doctrine here. But the center is always the most prominent thing. And here it's bread that's provided, and there's a focus on the Sabbath. Remember that they were supposed to gather twice as much on the sixth day, and as a matter of fact, a great many verses in Exodus 16 are devoted to gathering twice as much on the sixth day and not gathering on the seventh and all that stuff. Why is the Sabbath at the center of this section? Why is it in the book of Exodus that the Sabbath would be at the center of this chiastic structure? Well, Sabbath is a sign of the Mosaic covenant. In Exodus particularly, the Sabbath is the major theme. You have to remember way back to when we started this, but we talked about it a little bit, and here's a chance to talk about it again. Exodus moves from slavery to Sabbath. And so, throughout the book, the idea is a God who gives rest. I have heard the trials of my people, and they're crying, and I will give them rest. And the idea in the Ten Commandments is to give rest to your subordinates. When we get to the law of the covenant, we'll find that the first laws in the book of the covenant in chapter 21 had to do with releasing slaves in the 7th year, giving rest. The last set of laws had to do with Sabbath years. Those bracket the laws. And at the end of the book, we find the tabernacle set up, and God moves into it enthroned and gives his people rest. So we go from Pharaoh on the throne in the cities that were built by slave labor to God on the throne in the tabernacle that's built by voluntary contributions. But the movement of the book is from slavery to Sabbath, from a time when you never get a chance to rest to a time when God has given you rest. And I think, again, that this is pointed to by the fact that here, in this sandwich structure here, the Sabbath is what's highlighted. On the Sabbath is associated with God's giving bread. The water is associated with testing here. And that all takes place within the defeat of the enemy. God establishes his kingdom. So that's the structure of the passage, and we've already looked at everything A, B, and C. We're at B prime today. So we're in Exodus 17 and verse 1. Chapter 17. Let's read these 7 verses, and then you'll remember the story, and then we can talk about it more profitably. Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages. That is, they journeyed from place to place, from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. That means the plains. And there was no water for the people to drink. So this was not like Spain, where the rain falls mainly in the plain. There was no water in the plains of Rephidim. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test Yahweh?" The people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses. So now they're grumbling again. And said, "Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to Yahweh, saying, "What shall I do with this people? A little more and they will stone me." And then Yahweh said to Moses, "Pass before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. And you will strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he named the place Test and Quarrel, Massah and Meribah, because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested Yahweh, saying, "Is Yahweh among us or not?" Verse 1. The location is Rephidim, or the plains, which is in front of Mount Sinai. Then all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, and there was no water. But we find out in verse 6, "I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb." Now, the way to see this is, here is Mount Sinai, which is also Horeb. Horeb is probably the name for a larger community of things. And then this is the plains of Rephidim. I'm just saying the same thing twice. This is Rephidim, which means plains. And here are the people. And this is where there's no water. Moses takes the elders over somewhere on this mountain here, strikes a rock, and water flows out to the people here. Also, this is where the Amalekites are going to fight them, right here in front of the mountain. And this is where Jethro is going to come and visit them, right here in front of the mountain. During the battle with the Amalekites, Moses stations himself on the hill. So he's probably up here on some part of Horeb near this water. And all of this has a certain amount of symbolic meaning, you see. Right underneath God's throne is where this battle with the Amalekites takes place. And while Moses keeps his hands up, and that almost certainly means has his staff in the air, because we've seen that when Moses' hands are doing something, it's his staff doing something. When he holds that staff up, the Amalekites are defeated, and that means that he's holding up this memorial of God. And we'll get more of that later. But here you see the water flows out from Mount Sinai down here and gives the people water. So this is the location, the plains in front of Horeb. And it's important to see that they didn't get there by accident. It says, in their journeyings, according to the mouth of the Lord. So it was God who brought them there. God who brought them to the place where the test is. They didn't just happen to get there. This didn't happen outside the providence of God. It's deliberate on God's part to bring them to a place where they would have to be tested again. They failed the first test. They grumbled and grumbled and grumbled about the bitter water, instead of just coming and saying, this water's bitter. Do you suppose you might ask the Lord to do something about it? No, they grumbled. And here they failed the test again, but it's the same basic kind of a test. So that's where we are, and that's how we got there. God brought them there to test them. Verses 2 to 4 bring up this theme of quarreling and grumbling again. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Quarreling is not the same word as grumbling. Grumbling is the one we've had up till now. Chapter 15:24, the people grumbled at Moses, saying, what will we drink at Marah? Here it says, Moses says, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Notice he identifies himself with the Lord. He's the Lord's representative. When they quarrel with him over this, they're not quarreling with him over his bad breath or something. They're quarreling with him over religious matter. That's a quarrel with God, who he represents. So they're quarreling with God. And it goes a little bit beyond grumbling. It's worse. They're testing him. Previously, he tested them. See, God is the one who tests us. We're not supposed to test him. So there's an advance in their sinfulness when they get to the point where they're going to test God. Now, verse 3 brings up the word grumble, and that is the word we've had up till now. The people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses. And they say, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill me and my children and my livestock with thirst? Everything is very personal. Each one of them is thinking this individually. Now, that's the word for grumble. And we've seen this kind of thing before. In chapter 14, verse 11, then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this the word we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. So this business of you just brought us out here to kill us, that's come up before, in fact, more than once. In chapter 16, verse 3. Well, let's look first of all at the Marah incident, verse 24. The people grumbled at Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And then chapter 16, the manna story, verse 3, the sons of Israel, well, verse 2, the whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of flesh and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So you really wanted to kill us, but unlike the Egyptians who just kind of died quick, you wanted to torture us to death by bringing us out here. Now they're saying it again. Why did you bring us out here to kill us with thirst? It really is amazing, amazingly childish, this response, but that is what we see. Unfortunately, we see it in ourselves sometimes, even if we have learned not to say these things out loud. We think them sometimes. Verse 4, Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do to this people? A little more, and they will stone me. When people are mad at God, they get mad at his representative. And they can't do anything to God, so they'll do it to Moses. And they're ready to stone Moses. This probably ties with this stone and rock theme in this passage, although I'm not sure exactly how, but you'll notice that we're told, the Holy Spirit tells us, that Moses was concerned about being stoned, and then God will go and stand on the rock, and the rock is going to be struck. So a little later on, Moses hides in the rock, and other things happen with the rock. There's probably some connection here, and that's why the business of stoning is brought up, but I don't exactly see how the connection works. So I can't pass anything on to you then. Sorry. Now, verses 5 and 6 bring us to the amazing event. The Lord said to Moses, now watch this structure here in your notes. We have another chiastic structure that centers in on God's coming and standing on the rock. And we've seen the quarreling and grumbling, and then notice how these two verses are structured. Yahweh said to Moses, pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. And then C, take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And then at the center, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. then C prime, you will strike the rock and water will come out of it that the people may drink. And then B prime, Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And then verse 7, A prime, he named the place Quarrel and Test because of the quarreling and the testing. So you see how the structure is, and once again we have a central idea is highlighted, which is that God would be positioning himself on the rock at Sinai or on Horeb. And this is to deal with this quarreling and grumbling, and it's done in the sight of the elders. Now let's look at the various features of this, because every bit of it's important. The stage is set here. First of all, it says, pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. So here we are encamped at Rephidim, and Moses is going to walk through all these people, and he's going to gather some of the elders, and then he's going to go up here to some place on Horeb, on Mount Sinai, to take care of this water problem. But it says, pass before the people, walk through the midst of the people. Why would it emphasize that? Well, to understand why it would emphasize that, we need to ask the next question. Why is it so important that Moses take the elders? And why is it so important that the elders watch this take place? What kind of scene do we have here? And let me give you some options so you'll know what kind of question I'm asking. Is this a mob scene? Is it a worship assembly? Is it a classroom? Teaching assembly? Is it a law court? Of those four, which is it? This is a classroom, but not in the text. Why are the elders brought along? What do elders do? They're the judges. It's a law court. This is a law court. This is a trial, because the Lord is on trial. So the elders are brought out here to form a law court. Now we're going to see the Lord is on trial, puts himself on trial, and the elders come as a law court, and this is done publicly in the sight of the people. So that's why the emphasis is there on the passing before the people, and that's why the emphasis is on the elders. The elders form a law court, and although the people are not, all 2 million plus the mixed multitude is not going to come gathering around this little rock on Mount Horeb, still, their representatives, the elders, will go out and they will observe this legal transaction. Judicial theology. Judgment is going to take place. Because it's the staff that struck the Nile. Notice Moses' staff has done all kinds of stuff in Exodus. Might be fun one week just to go through and collect together all the arborescent imagery we've seen in Exodus so far. From the burning bush, arbor means tree. From the burning bush to all these staffs. Moses takes a staff, then there's Aaron's staff, and later on Aaron's staff is going to blossom. But Moses' staff brought these plagues. Moses' staff strikes the Nile River. It strikes the Nile. Now what was that when it struck the Nile? What happened to the Nile? It turned to blood, so it was a judgment on the Nile. And the emphasis here is on judgment. This rod struck the Nile. It brought the other plagues. Moses stretched it out, and the Red Sea parted for the people to go through, and then he stretched it out again, and the Red Sea killed the Egyptians. So it is a rod of judgment. And that's the one he's going to take. And the emphasis here is on judgment. It's not just take your staff. It's in case we miss the point. It's not just this branch broken off of the tree, but it is in particular the one that has brought judgment on the Egyptians. And what we're going to see here is an epiphany or a revelation of why it is that the Israelites weren't destroyed when the Egyptians were. See, that's a question that's hung in the air. We know the doctrine of election. The first 3 plagues were against both the Israelites and the Egyptians, but then God said, I will put a difference. The last 6 plagues only came upon the Egyptians, not on the Israelites. And then the 10th plague, each person, Israelite and Hebrew, had to make his own decision about putting blood on the door. But God made a difference. God passed over, and we saw that the Lamb was slain to make that possible. And that gives us a hint. It's how it's possible for God to pass by the judgment of some people when He judges others. It's because of eternal election, but there's no justice there in eternal election. People are still sinners and they still deserve to die. How is it that God can spare them? Well, God spares them because an animal is killed, but it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. So that Passover lamb, that didn't do anything. That didn't take away any sin. And killing that lamb did not make it possible for God to pass them by. That was an expression of faith in something else. Somehow or other, God Himself would make a way. But the act of killing the animal itself didn't substitute for them. It only represented something else that would substitute. Now we come to a passage that begins to make it even clearer. Why wasn't Israel judged? Well, it's because God takes the judgment they deserve. So here we get, in symbolism or revelation, it's not the blood of an animal that is going to make it possible for God to spare Israel. It's God Himself being hit by the staff. The same staff that hits the Nile and brings judgment on the wicked is the staff that hits Christ and brings judgment on Him for us. That's substitutionary atonement. It's judicial theology. And this is a very judicial scene. It's a law court. Somebody's guilty. God says, well, you can hit me. I'll be the guilty one. You hit the Nile. The Egyptians deserve to die, but you deserve to die too. Why weren't you hit? Because I'm going to be hit. I'll be on the rock, and I'll be hit. So, the staff that struck the Nile is the one that's going to strike God. Now, verse 6 says, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. So now let's get a clearer picture of this. We have here at Horeb some little hill here, and let's make a rock here on it. And God says, I will come down and be on the rock. Now that means the Shekinah cloud would be above this rock. So these elders, they will see the pillar of cloud and fire. Remember, it looks like a cloud in the daytime, and at night when it's dark you see into it and there's fire in it. Just what Ezekiel sees in Ezekiel 1. So this pillar of cloud and fire is going to come down here and settle right on top of this rock. He says, I will come and be with you on the rock. Now that compares, and it's going to be important for us to understand this. A few days later, God comes down and He sits on top of Mount Sinai, which is a great big huge rock. So there's a parallel between these two events, and we'll need to keep them in mind. But this cloud on the rock at Horeb is the same as the cloud on Horeb itself. Just keep that visual image in mind. And He says, verse 6, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you will strike the rock, and water will come out of it. Now what Moses does is he brings that staff right down through the Shekinah glory and onto the rock. So who gets struck? God is willing to be struck. And in particular, the rock is struck. The rock is associated with God and made a symbol of God or of Yahweh. Let's be clear here. Who is this Yahweh? Is it the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit? The Son. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son has revealed Him. Every time you read Jehovah or Lord or Yahweh in the Old Testament, it is always the second person of the Trinity. It's Jesus. Always. We could translate the Old Testament if we wanted to, and every time we have the word Lord, just say Jesus. That's who it is. Pre-incarnate Christ. It's never the Father. Can't be. The Son is the one who reveals the Father, particularly in the Old Testament. So what's wrong with Jehovah's Witnesses, by the way? They think Jehovah is God the Father, or God, period, and Jesus is just a creature. That doesn't work. There's other evidence for that, too. But see, it's Christ who's here. Christ who's struck by the staff, revealing what will come in the future, revealing what will actually make possible all these things, what the Passover lamb only symbolized. God is struck. The second person of the Trinity is struck. So Moses is told to strike the rock. It will pass through the cloud, and in particular, it will hit the rock. The rock is the focus of attention here. And then water will come out of it. Well, we know enough New Testament theology not to be surprised at that. Water will flow out from Mount Sinai and give the people who are out here on the plains the water that they need. It will water all of their animals. And how long were they here? You remember? They were here a year. This is where they were camped for a year. They built the tabernacle here and everything. It's a year from now when they finally move out and start to go through the wilderness to conquer the Holy Land, and then they have to be stuck out there for 38 more years. They were here for a year. You don't hear any more about water problems. And then we're not going to gripe about water again until they leave Sinai. Then they'll gripe about water again 2 or 3 more times, as I recall. But here, there's water. This water keeps coming the whole year. Christ is struck once, but the water keeps coming. What does the water represent? Life. And who is the Lord and giver of life? Now, we don't say the Nicene Creed enough here. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Spirit proceeds from the Son, and in particular, in redemption, He proceeds from the Son when the Son is struck. It's the death of Jesus Christ that makes possible the sending of the Holy Spirit and water. So that's part of what's going on there, and we'll look at it in more detail in just a second. We have this judgment scene, the rock is struck, water comes out of it, and the people drink. And that'll continue to be the case for as long as they're at Mount Sinai. Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he named the place Massa, which means test. Verse 7. You analyze it. What do you see? Test, quarrel, quarrel, test. He named the place Test and Quarrel because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel and because they tested the Lord. What's that structure? Chiastic. A, B, B, A. There's no C in this one, but it's still chiastic. A, B, B, A. Hebrew is written that way all the time. You'll notice many, many times individual sentences that are that way. And when we do the Psalms in church, if you look at them, take your bulletin home and look at the Psalm, you'll find many of the verses are that way. The first set of words is inverted in the second set of words in terms of their word order. So I just want to get you alert to this because it will help you as you read the Bible. Test, quarrel, quarrel, test. And certainly that associates the two. They quarrel with God, and God allows Himself to be tested. Now let's look at some of the themes that are here. Help us with larger things. One, start with the rock. Rock is a large theme in the Bible, and I'm just going to skim some things that I wrote in Through New Eyes about that to remind you of it. One thing we just see here, that God sits on the rock, and God takes the judgment that the people deserve. Thus God told them that He was their rock, and He would give them water. When God makes a covenant with Israel, what does He write it on? He writes it on a stone. He writes it on a rock. Tablets of stone. So it's permanent. See, rock is an image that has to do with permanence and hardness. Now, if we look over at Deuteronomy 32, we'll find the Song of the Rock. This is a song of Moses, but it can be called the Song of the Rock because it's full of stony imagery. Verses 3 and 4. Deuteronomy 32. I proclaim the name of the Lord. I proclaim Yahweh's name. So we make this very personal if we say Yahweh, because that reminds us that this is Jesus. I will proclaim Yahweh's name. Ascribe greatness to our God, the rock. His work is perfect, for all His ways are just. A God of faithfulness and without injustice, righteous and upright is He. God the rock. God is Sinai, the place where you meet God. God is this rock. Verses 15 and 16. But Jeshurun, Israel, grew fat and kicked. You are grown fat, thick, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scorned the rock of his salvation. They made him jealous with strange gods, with abominations that provoked him to anger. Bad rocks. Verse 18. You neglected the rock who begot you. You forsook the God who gave you birth. What kind of image is that? A rock that begets. What comes out of the rock? Yeah, water, life. See, the Bible is constantly conflating images. We are not supposed to mix metaphors in English poetry. But the Bible mixes metaphors all the time. The imagery in the Bible is like one of those pictures of a human body in a biology book where on the page there's a skeleton, and then you have an acetate that you lay over it that has the arteries. And then you have another acetate that has the veins. And then you have another acetate that has the nerves. And then you have another acetate that has the muscles. And you kind of lay them over each other until you get the whole person. Well, that's what biblical imagery is like. You've got the rock here, water comes out of it, but that means also people come out of it because God gives birth to people as He gives birth to water. And it's the water of the Spirit that gives us new birth. And you see how this all runs together. And that's the idea here. The rock who begot you. God gave birth to us. And it's when the rock is struck that the new birth is possible. But they make God jealous with strange gods. They make little rocks and carve them up and make them into idols. And that they set those little rocks that they've carved in opposition to the rock. Verses 30 and 31. How could one chase 1,000 and two put a myriad to flight unless their rock had sold them, unless Yahweh had given them up? In other words, how could we lose these battles except that Yahweh had given us up? Indeed, their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies themselves judge this. The gods of other nations are like little rocks without much to them. Israel will be foolish to forsake the true rock, because in time God will destroy all these pebbles. Verse 37, He will say, where are their gods, the rocks in which they sought refuge? These little rocks, crumbly, pumice-like things that float on the water, these aren't rocks that are any good. You can't hide inside of them, like Moses hid inside the rock. Now, there's plenty of this in the Bible. In 1 Samuel 2, verse 2, when Samuel was born, Hannah says, there is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides thee, nor is there any rock like our God. David celebrates God as his rock. This is in 2 Samuel 22. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, as Moses did. For who is God besides the Lord? Who is a rock beside our God? The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock. Exalted be God, the rock of my salvation. See how pervasive this is? And the Psalms are full of it. Let me just read you a few real quick. Psalm 28, verse 1. To Thee, O Lord, I call, my rock, do not be deaf to me. That's almost funny. You talk to a rock and tell a rock not to be deaf. If there's anything that's deaf, it's a rock. They say if you talk to your plants, they hear you and they grow better. But we don't think rocks hear anything. And yet here, the rock does. Psalm 31, 2 and 3. Incline thine ear to me, rescue me quickly. Be thou to me a rock of strength, a stronghold to save me. For thou art my rock and my fortress. Psalm 42, verse 9. I will say to God, my rock, why hast thou forsaken me? Why do I go about in mourning? Psalm 95, verse 1. O come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Isaiah calls God the rock. Isaiah 17:10. You have forgotten the God of your salvation and not remembered the rock of your refuge. Isaiah 26, verse 4. Trust in the Lord forever, for in God the Lord we have an everlasting rock. Now, this also settles some other ambiguous passages. I'll show you one, and maybe I've called this to your attention before, but Psalm 137, bad mistranslation in most Bibles. The very last verse of Psalm 137. How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Your Bible may have against the stones, plural, or against the rocks, plural, but that's not correct. This Bible has it right, except the R is not capitalized, so excuse me just a moment here while I capitalize this R. You see, dashing the little ones against the rock in the Psalms is always God. And this is as much an image of salvation as it is judgment. Jeremiah told the people when they go to Babylon to pray for the peace of the Babylonians. So these people are not giving an unambiguous curse on Babylon. This is an ambiguous prayer. Dash their children against the rock. That may mean conversion or it may mean death. But it's a double meaning here. In a sense, infant baptism dashes our children against the rock. What are some other rock images in the Bible that you can think of? Where do we see rocks? Cast your mind around the Bible. Use stream of consciousness, exegesis and hermeneutics here, and stream out any rocks that you can find. Peter is a rock. We'll get to that. Stones are used for execution. What would that point to? Judgment. God judging people. God judges people and stones are thrown on them. Jesus said everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. Luke 20:17-18. Falling on the stone and being broken is an image of salvation, but the stone falling on you is an image of judgment, because stoning is the prescribed method of execution. Are there any stones that grow in the Bible? Daniel 2, a stone cut without hands grows until it becomes a mountain. Now notice, see, I've already pointed out the similarities between this rock with the Shekinah on it and Mount Sinai with the Shekinah on it. You know, the rock growing to be a mountain is not a new idea with Daniel. Now there's actually something in between a rock and a mountain. Is there anything in the Bible that's made of rocks that you see all the time? It's always made of rocks. An altar. See, an altar is a pile of rocks. And the bronze altar that we'll study in Exodus was just an empty shell of bronze plates that they filled up with rocks. And so you make a pile of rocks. You go from a rock to a pile of rock that is a miniature holy mountain, and that's why the fire is on it, representing God's presence. Or the incense is on it, representing God's presence, the cloud. And then all of that recapitulates the mountain with God on top. So, more rocks. That's where you worship God. You come to the rocks. You kill an animal on these rocks. What else do you do with the rock? You build your house on a rock. What's the most important rock in the house? Foundation. What's the most important rock in the foundation? What's the most important rock among the cornerstones? The chief cornerstone. How many cornerstones are there? 4. How many mighty men did David have? 3. Remember? David and his 3 mighty men? And who was the 4th? David himself. How many mighty men did Jesus have? Peter, James, and John. And the chief cornerstone. That's a pattern. The chief cornerstone, you put it in the ground, and it does 3 things for the building. First of all, it tells you the orientation. You set it here, and this is how it's going to be north and east. Or southeast and whatever. But that's going to give you the direction of the building. It's also going to give you the size of the building, because if you're going to build a great big building, you need a big chief cornerstone. And this is almost too obvious, but it gives you the location of the building. It's here instead of being here. So the chief cornerstone tells you where the building is, how it's oriented, its shape, and how big it's going to be. And then you also have the other lesser cornerstones at the other corners. And you put them up first, and then you fill in so that you've got 12 major stones all around, and then you're ready to start building. That's how it works. Your chief cornerstone. See all these rocks. Rocks give shade in the Bible. Isaiah 4:6, Isaiah 25, verse 4. A shadow of a mighty rock within a weary land. We have it in our songs taken from those verses. Well, if we're the image of God, then what are we? We're rocks. Now, when we think of rocks, we think of brown rocks. But what's a glorified rock? Name some. Gold, silver, precious stones, diamonds, hard rocks, shiny rocks. In the Bible, what are all the little rocks pictured as? On the high priest's breastplate, there are 12 semi-precious stones, all different colors. God's temple is built out of rocks. Isaiah 32 verse 2 says, each will be a refuge, each will be a rock in a parched land. Stones of fire. These are all rocks. So, it's pervasive in the Bible. The rock is struck. Water comes out. Second of all, just to get some of these themes out, and since they're in your notes, we don't need to talk about them a great deal. But second, Mount Sinai is the great rock on which God sits. And the tabernacle, as I've mentioned before and we'll see again, is a kind of a portable Sinai. The tabernacle has the same structure as Sinai, and wherever it goes, Sinai goes. So God is always with you. And the mountain is always accessible. When the ark comes to Jerusalem, then Sinai comes to Moriah, and the two are equivalent. Jesus is the incarnation of the tabernacle and the rock, and I think that this sheds light on Zechariah 14, verses 3 to 9, which I won't read because of the time, but you can look it up. And you'll find there that a mountain is split in half, and water comes out of it. And I think what's happened there is we've moved from a little rock that's split and water comes out, to a great big mountain that's split and water comes out. And as soon as that happens, the wicked are defeated. And as soon as this rock is split, we're going to see the Amalekites defeated. When Christ is judged, then the water comes out for His people, and the wicked are either defeated, like Amalek, or converted, like Jethro. And those are the next things we're going to look at. The rock is struck, God's people are provided for, and then the world is conquered by being destroyed or converted. Zechariah 14 has the same structure. Exactly what events are predicted there could be a matter of discussion and debate, but the imagery seems to derive itself from this passage. See, it's actually Mount of Olives that is split in half and water comes out. Well, the third wider theme that's here is water. Water represents life, John 7:37-38 says, out of your inmost parts will come rivers of living water. So water comes out from persons and it comes out from us. This water coming out from these rocks here at Mount Horeb and going out and watering this plain is an image of the Garden of Eden restored. Genesis 13:10 says that the circle of the Jordan was well watered throughout, like the land of Egypt and like the garden of God. That was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the idea of a plain that is watered is an image of the Garden of Eden, an image of what the land of Egypt is like, a paradise-like location, and that's what God sets up right here at the foot of Mount Horeb. If you're at the foot of Sinai, you're in a restored Eden situation. The fact is, Jesus thirsted on the cross that we might have His water, which flowed from His side. He was struck with a sword, and out of His side came water and blood, all continuing this same imagery here. Then we can make a comparison with Exodus 15:22-27. We've already made some of those comparisons. That was the earlier water test, Marah. The bride fails the test, but the Lord passes it for her. They grumbled, but God passes the test. And we can also see a little bit more about the tree that was tossed into the water there at Marah. We studied the idea that the tree is for healing and ultimately points to Christ. Now we have a little bit more information about that. The tree heals the water because the rod or staff has judged. So it's the same judgment. The judgment that falls upon Christ is a healing thing for us. When it comes into our water, it heals us because Jesus took the judgment we deserved. Otherwise, when that tree came into our lives, when the staff falls on us, we would be judged and be destroyed and killed. But instead, when it comes to us, it's already passed through judgment and comes to us as healing. So these two passages shed light on each other, and that's one of the reasons why it's useful to look at the structure of the passage and see how they're balancing. They're two B sections chiastically arranged. Fifth, I mentioned this links with the defeat of Amalek, which we'll look at next week. All of this takes place in plains before Sinai, and after God takes a judgment on Himself, the nations are converted or destroyed. And so we'll look at the war against Amalek and the coming of Jethro and his bond to God's people, and how the gospel goes to the Gentiles after the Jews are provided for. There's one other thing I want to point out to you. When God says to Peter, you are like a rock, and on this rock I will build my church, they're standing at a place called Petra, which means rock. And it's the headwaters of the Jordan River, and what there is a great big exposed batholith there. In other words, it's a big, huge rock. And the Jordan River flows out from there. So you see this business of water coming from the rock. It has another aspect to it, and that is if you go to Palestine and you go to where the Jordan River starts, it comes out of a rock. And Jesus says, I am the big rock, Peter, and you are a little rock. And upon these rocks, upon the big rock, I will build my church. But see the implication, all the Old Testament background there, and also right where they're standing, is going to remind them that the rock has to be struck for the kingdom to grow, and for the waters of the Jordan, those baptismal waters of the Jordan, to come out. Well, if that happens to the rock, it also happens to us. God's judgments fall on us and are painful, but as a result, water flows out of us. See, out of your innermost parts will flow rivers of living water. This is not just a sign here. Ultimately, it's primarily a sign of Jesus taking judgment on Himself and giving us the transforming water. But at a secondary level, these are the things that happen to us as well because we're rocks. And we walk in the Master's footsteps. And to the extent to which, unfortunately, because of our sin, God has to take us through painful times in order to make us fit for ministry. But that's what happens. The judgment falls on you and you become a better person in ways you don't understand. Water flows out. Suffering is what tends to make ministry possible and viable. I think people who are undergoing hard times and come out the other side have no awareness many times as to how much water flows out from them to minister to other people. But that is the way God does it. And the epistles, I talk about that quite a bit, where Paul talks about how his sufferings are helping the churches and the like. It seems to be that God deals with us this way as well. From time to time, when you least expect it, the staff falls on you. Remember that in Acts chapter 2, the Shekinah comes upon the head of the people. So the cloud on the rock here, the cloud on the altar, the cloud on the mountain, we are now the rock, the altar, and the mountain, and the cloud is on us. So we can not be so surprised when suffering comes. The New Testament talks about it so much. Because it's this striking of the rock that makes the water flow out and makes the kingdom grow. And that's one of the realities of the Christian life. I had more things to say about that, but our time is up. I think you can fill in the blanks on that one out of your own experience. Let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the pictures of the kingdom that you give us, and we thank you for the encouragement. We don't look forward to times of distress and times when you bring your rod down upon us, but we see that this is a short life, that we will not live more than 70 or 80 years, and after that it's all over and forever. And we know that the difficulties that you bring our way are designed to make us softer and enable water to come out from us that will be life to others. And so we accept that, and we ask that you would help us to accept it and not be grumblers. When we find that the water of our life is bitter, that you would enable us not to be grumblers, but to be faithful brides, and that those tests would show faithfulness to you, and that